The power of the lady was known to be such that future generations of knights would continue to seek her out to have an opportunity to drink from the same grail and become Grail Knights reborn. Welcome everyone to the first episode of the Old World Chronicles, a Warhammer The Old World Lore podcast. My name is Lewis, and I will be your humble guide as we explore the world of legends together. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel or podcast feed and share it with your friends if you enjoy the episode. And if you are watching on YouTube, please like this video and add any comments you have below. We really appreciate your support, and your engagement helps us to please the mightiest god in all of the old world, the algorithm. If you have any suggestions for topics you'd like to see covered in this series, please comment below and I'll take these on board. Now, in terms of how this series is going to work, this is our first dedicated 6++ lore show for the Old World. And in my opinion, the Old World has such a rich tapestry of history and stories dating right back to the original Warhammer game. So this is something I'm really keen to dive into and explore on this show. I'm expecting the shows to be released around once a month or so. But if this first episode is anything to go by, it actually takes a huge amount of work to put one of these together. So please don't hold me to that if it takes me a little bit longer. I'm very much going for a relaxed vibe for the show. So I really want to make something that's easy listening for whilst you're painting or driving, that sort of thing. But if you are watching on YouTube, I'll prepare a slideshow of images of the topic we're discussing. But really, this is here something for you to listen to. Today, I'm going to introduce you to a seminal character from one of the premier factions in the Old World. A character that epitomizes the rules of chivalry and honor that make his faction so special. And it's a man that founded a nation. A welcome to the Old World Chronicles, to the first Grail Knight himself, Gilles Le Breton. So please, sit back, relax, and enjoy. So, before we dive into the story of Gilles Le Breton, I'm going to make some apologies now, mostly around my incorrect pronunciation of names of characters or places. I've tried looking up the French pronunciation of the names which commonly occur in today's parlance, but I am no means an expert linguist. I can just about manage English. So please forgive me for any transgressions which occur as we move forwards. Now, to understand the life of Gilles Le Breton, it's important to go back in the narrative timeline slightly and remind ourselves of the history of his kingdom, Bretonnia, in a little bit more detail. Bretonnia occupies the land between the Grey Mountains and the forest of Athel-Lorraine in the east, and the Great Ocean in the west. It was settled by the warlike Bretonii tribes approximately 1000 years BIC. Now, by BIC, I mean years before the start of the Empire's imperial calendar. And that calendar started in a year in which the twin-tailed comet appeared in the night sky above the Empire of Man. Now, I appreciate the myriad races of the Old World will have their own calendar systems and naming conventions for dates, and I mean no offence to those races or the fans thereof by referring back to the lands of the Empire as our reference point. For ease across all of the episodes, we're going to use the Imperial calendar as our guide, and dates that are given in IC will refer to years after the Imperial calendar begins. Clearly, there may be times where it's not possible to use this dating system, for example, with any episodes we might produce that go back far into the deep past, but I'll endeavour to make it clear when we're deviating from the norm. Now, the early centuries of the Bretonii tribe's existence in their new home was tumultuous, to say the least. They soon learned of the wood elves in the forest of Athel-Lorraine and the risks associated with walking amongst those most ancient trees, and a deep fear of these lands soon developed by the people in the tribes. The Bretonii were also forced to contend with pretty desperate fights for survival against sinister undead invaders rising up from the Great Ocean, and orc and goblin tribes roaming down from the Pale Sisters Mountains, and even chaotic beastmen coming straight out of the forests of Ardennes. However, I think what really kept the Bretonii from becoming properly established in their new homelands was probably the petty squabbles amongst their own kind. The tribes were broken down into numerous divided fiefdoms, each with their own customs, warriors and traditions, and then they were never truly united, The fiefdoms and their dukes rose and fell seemingly with the passing of each season for almost 300 years, until around 700 BIC, when about 20 main tribes emerged as the claimants to the land that would eventually become known as Bretonia. Now, this isn't the place to dive into the wars and fights that happened between this time and the arrival of Gilles, but it should be noted that Sigmar, somewhere around 8 BIC, did make an offer to the Bretoni to join him as part of the lands which would become the Empire. The tribes, proud, maybe foolish, refused his offer of alliance. They elected to walk their own path. And actually, who knows what would have become of the Bretoni had it not been for this episode's namesake. Would this decision not to unite with Sigmar have meant that they would have passed into history beneath the iron-shod boots of the orcs? Or perhaps the Empire would eventually have had to contend with a second undead dynasty on its western borders, as well as those hailing from Sylvania. We'll never know, of course, because of Gilles Le Breton. Gilles' date of birth is a little uncertain, based on his assumed age at the time of several key events. I think he would have been born around 935 to 940 IC, so putting us almost 1,000 years after the events of Blackfire Pass, the founding of the Empire, and over 1,500 years since that 20 or so main Bretoni tribes had established themselves. Gilles is confirmed very early on as their heir to the crown of Bastogne, Bastogne being one of the more central Bretoni tribes, situated with the forest of Ardennes to its north and the forest of Chalon to the south. Gilles' early life appears to have been similar to that of most Bretoni heirs. We can assume he was taught the customs, culture and ways of the Bastogne by his family and at court. And we can also be pretty confident in assuming he was instructed in the ways of battle, learning to ride a horse at an early age, wield a lance, and to handle himself in the dangerous melee of hand-to-hand combat. Now, jumping forward a little bit to about 947 IC, so when Gilles is about 7 or 8 years old, the northern tribes of the Bretoni above Bastogne have at least partially been overrun by a combination of greenskins, beastmen, and Northmen. Now, sensing the danger this posed to Bastogne, Gilles' father formed an alliance with Lyonesse to the northwest. He did this through the marriage of his daughter, Gilles' sister, Rosalind, to a young prince and heir of Lyonesse, Theorulf. Gilles and Theorulf get on well and become close friends, and we'll be hearing more about him soon. Now, this marriage really cements the ties between Bastogne and Lyonesse, and then their friendship strengthens it even further, ensuring the alliance holds together as they both become the lords of their respective realms. Bastogne, already embattled by the forces of destruction rampaging around the northern Bretoni tribes, was not ready for the arrival of the great red worm Smeargus in 952 IC, and this is the first moment where Gilles really comes into his own. Smeargus was a dragon said to be the size of a keep, with an appetite for destruction to match. The dragon carved a path of terror and death across Bastogne, destroying many settlements and killing numerous peasants and nobles. Now, although he wasn't yet the Lord of Bastogne, and probably still only somewhere between 12 to 17 years old, Gilles was set on ending this menace once and for all. He tracks Smeargus to the village of Knoelw, where he finds the dragon already burning down house after house. It actually feels almost like the dragon is toying with the populace here, as by the time Gilles arrives, it has effectively herded the population into the central market square of the village and produced a ring of fire around them. This is allowing the dragon to kind of swoop in and pluck out villagers, horses, cattle at will. The villagers dare not attempt to run through the flames the dragon has created, and so are sitting ducks, completely exposed and ultimately would be doomed to die a pretty horrible death at the hands of this dragon. Now, Gilles, despite being totally on his own, is guided by the same code of honour and chivalry that infuses all of the current Bretonian society. Now, it might not be an equal society, but nobles are there to protect their peasantry and will ride to their defence when the need arises. As such, Gilles clambers onto his huge warhorse and charges into the village. Now, in this tale, And it gets pretty fantastical at this point. Gilles' warhorse is said to be about 20 hands high, which, if anyone knows anything about horses, it's absolutely monstrous in size. And even more so when you consider again that Gilles is probably in his early to mid-teens at this point. Now, the average size horse in modern times is 14 to 16 hands high, with the largest horses reaching maybe 18 hands. Now, we all know that Bretonian war horses are particularly impressive, and potentially they deserve a short episode of the Chronicles of the Old World all on their own. But this must really have been quite a beast for Gilles to ride and handle at his age. Now, that horse is said to have had no fear of battle, no fear of death whatsoever. Now, we know a couple of decades pass between this part of Gilles' story and when he next rises to prominence. So I suggest this probably isn't the same horse as the one he rides later, which is called the Lord of all Horses. But I mean, given the elven blood which flows through the Bretonian horses, it could well be the same horse. Now, Gilles charges through Smeagol's ring of fire into the town square where all of those villagers are trying to hide from the dragon. Now, jumping through that fire, I think Gilles probably suspects, and quite rightly, that he can't fight this dragon all on his own. As such, as he's riding through the fire, he calls upon the trapped peasants to take up arms to defend themselves. And you can imagine what this must have looked like to those terrified people. They're all sitting there trying to find shelter under upturned market stalls or carts that haven't quite caught fire yet, as the flames from the dragon lick up around them. And then suddenly they look up and see this shining knight riding a gigantic horse, leaping through the fire, screaming orders at them. The peasants, they seem to regain their composure at this point, as the records state that they start picking up bows and firing at the dragon as it swoops down to take on Gilles in what the dragon probably thinks is an easy meal, just one random knight on his own. The majority of the bow fire, as you could expect, does absolutely nothing. The arrows, they just bounce harmlessly off the hide of the dragon. And that is really until an incredibly lucky shot strikes Smeagol in the eye, causing it to rear up at the exact moment Gilles' charge hits home. Gilles' lance strikes the dragon in between its scales and drives into its heart. Smeagol starts to thrash around now, probably finishing off more than one peasant who got too close, and eventually crashing and landing in the ring of fire. Gilles is thrown off his horse here, but he's able to recover without too serious injury. He takes out his sword, walks into the flames, and rams it through the dragon's skull, thus ending the menace. With Smeagol down and the flames dying out, Gilles takes enough scales from the dragon's body to have a cloak made that he's seen to wear throughout the rest of his military career. There's actually a really incredible portrait of him hanging in Castle Bastogne now, which shows him wearing this cloak. This portrait is actually a pilgrimage site for thousands of Bretonian knights from across the realm, and was described by someone that made the pilgrimage as follows, quote, "He knelt humbly with his head bowed, his famous dragon skin cloak thrown over his shoulders. Gilles had slain the malevolent great worm Smeagol when he was little more than a boy, and had cut the cloak from its flesh. The revered artifact hung in the Duke of Bastogne's castle, and every year thousands of knights made the pilgrimage to stand beneath it in awe." End quote. Another couple of decades pass without major incident for Gilles until the year 975 IC. Not only are the northern lands of the Bretonny tribes still being ravaged by various foes, orcs have now invaded the southern lands of the tribes too, and are moving north into Bastogne. Gilles' father leads an army out to stop them, and leading from the front as is only right for a Bretonny king, Gilles' father falls, defending his home from this army of greenskins. Gilles was present at that battle, but he was actually elsewhere on the battlefield at the time. But he sees his father go down and immediately mounts his mighty charger, the Lord of all Horses, and rides out to avenge his father. So we can see 975 IC, the Lords of all Horses is here. Again, not 100% sure if it's the same horse as before. But Gilles is able to charge into the greenskin hordes and repel the invasion. break the greenskin lines, and save Bastogne. But I think realistically, this is only a temporary reprieve, because in terms of the wider context, things are getting pretty desperate here now for the Bretonnic tribes throughout this time period. Basically, the only areas of what we now call Bretonnia that are not overrun are Bastogne, Mousillon, and Lyonesse. Everywhere else is either under siege by various powers or has already been completely ravaged. We even see examples of where the Greenskins and other foes are turning their attention to the forest of Athel-Lorraine, previously shielded by the presence of the Bretonnic. Thinking that this is the end of the Bretonnic tribes, Gilles joins up with his old friend, who we mentioned earlier, Thiroulf of Lyonesse, and Lord Landuin of Mousillon, for one of the last great battles around the forest of Chalon. The sources suggest that the feeling amongst the camp here is they don't think they have much hope, and they're likely eventually to lose. And realistically, even if they were to win the battle before them, they're still completely surrounded by enemies, and it'll only really take the invasion of Greenskins from the south to be combined with a pushdown from the north by the Beastmen or the Northmen to totally finish them, as they just won't be able to defend everywhere at once. Now, luckily, and you'd probably describe this as the start of the turning point in the history of the Bretonnic tribes, this doesn't happen. Their foes up north either haven't quite yet completely overrun the provinces, so don't move south, meaning Gilles, Thiroulf, and Landuin are able to join their armies together, and means that they can focus on the threat from the south and then pick off one threat at a time. And also, probably mostly importantly, this is the moment at which the Lady of the Lake appears in our tale. Gilles' army is camped out in the forest of Chalon, as we mentioned, when he starts to receive visions of a fey being in a lake adjoining the camp. Now, the visions he gets doesn't scare Gilles, as it might for some. He's already killed a dragon, obviously, so he's pretty fearless. And he senses that the being that's contacting him isn't an enemy, despite clearly possessing pretty immense power. So Gilles takes Thiroulf and Landuin and makes his way to the shores of the lake, where the Lady of the Lake presents herself to them. Now, she immediately blesses Gilles and inscribes a vision of herself onto his war banner, imbuing it with great power. She offers them a drink from a magnificent golden chalice. And when they each do so, they are suffused with superhuman strength. Their eyes start to glow with a green flame, and their weapons and armour begin to shine with new power. Gilles, Thiroulf, and Landuin become the first Grail Knights. Thiroulf and Landuin become known as Gilles' first companions, soon to become the famous group, the Grail Companions, arguably the greatest warriors who ever lived. Despite seeming to appear out of nowhere in the narrative, the lady comes up over and over again in the histories from now on. Through her visions and prophecies, she effectively guides the campaign that follows by imbuing Gilles with visions of where to go next and how quickly he should act. She can be quite a hard taskmaster, and she does drive the companions on, even when they desperately think they want to rest. However, she can also be beneficent. She grants them restful sleep, she heals their wounds, and can even stop death in its tracks for those she favours. And we won't go into loads of detail here, but there are multiple stories of where the Grail companions dive headlong into fights in which they have no right to survive any more than 5 minutes, but somehow come out the other side miraculously unharmed. Now, I think the lady deserves an episode of the Old World Chronicles all on her own, I think, so we'll come back to her in a future episode. So, by the end of the coming campaign, Gilles, as we know, is going to have 13 companions. Now, these companions become the lords of the Bretonnic tribes, which still are the ones that are holding out against all odds. And in each instance where these companions are liberated, the lady reappears and has them drink again from the Grail. This imbues each of the companions with the same powers that Thiroulf and Landuin have generated for themselves in that first meeting. With this newfound power, Gilles and his companions take the battle to the enemies encroaching on all sides. Now, this campaign, which runs between sort of 975 IC and 979 IC, becomes known as Gilles' 12 Great Battles. The majority of these battles involve liberating one or more of the other lords from the Bretonnian tribes, and slowly Gilles will have each lord swear allegiance to him and the banner of the lady. Now, it's really important to note that none of these battles are fought against other Bretonnian tribes. So, unlike previous warlords in the history of the Bretonnian, who thought they might be able to unite all of the tribes with force, the other lords all join Gilles willingly. Now, Gilles starts by heading west and crushing a greenskin horde between the Forest of Chalon and the Great Ocean. Here, he earns the allegiance of the lords of Bordelot and Aquitaine in his first two battles. The lady steps in here as well by calming the seas so they can actually just walk through it between battle after battle. Gilles then moves south to the bottom of the Bretonnian lands and relieves Castle Brion from more greenskins, before heading east through Carcassonne to Knoelw. The Lord of Carcassonne just simply sees the banner of the lady and swears allegiance immediately in joining the cause. They then fight a battle at Knoelw on the borders of the Athalloran forest, where actually the greenskins, as we mentioned earlier, are making inroads into the forest itself. They're burning down trees, they're cutting them down to feed their war effort. And so the companions are actually joined in this battle by the Wood Elves. Gilles henceforth becomes a friend of the Fae, and that doesn't seem to then translate into future generations of Bretonnians, as I'm sure the current relationship between the two powers isn't exactly amazing. Something probably to do with those fickle elves, I'm sure. Gilles then liberates Paravon before moving on to save Montfort from the Night Goblins. Now, this is the sixth battle at Montfort, and Gilles is actually struck down here by a bolt from a goblin war machine. His companions are devastated. They bear Gilles into the castle, where physicians and surgeons proclaim that their great hero is surely to pass away that night. And I think here is the darkest moment of the 12 battles, as the companions themselves felt that all was lost, and Gilles was going to pass away, and Bretonnia was going to fade into extinction. As dawn broke, however, the companions were awakened by a savage roar from Gilles' chamber. Gilles had grasped the bolt in his chest and pulled it free. As he did so, holy light streamed from his wound as the power of the lady took hold and returned Gilles to the land of the living. It's said that vengeance, pure vengeance, motivated Gilles that day. He single-handedly fought and bested 3 wyverns that descended upon him, finishing the last with the very bolt that had almost slain him the day before. It took a full week of fighting to relieve Montfort from the siege of the Night Goblins, but they were indeed victorious. Gilles then pursued the Night Goblins back into their caves, before returning to liberate Gisereau. After this 8th battle, the companions returned to the lands of Mousillon, Landuin's home, thinking they'll be able to take a rest before pushing on. In their absence, however, the land had been turned into a blackened wasteland. Slaughtered corpses carpeted the ground, and the once pure river had turned foul. They were soon joined by the desperate Lord of Artois, who was riding hard to bring warning of a great host approaching them under an unnatural full moon. The undead host fell upon Castle Mousillon as Gilles and his companions defended it. In this battle, Gilles somehow hews the head off a zombie dragon, whilst Thiarulf single-handedly wrestles a 2-headed giant. But Landuin comes into his own here. He saves his home city by striking down the foul vampire lord at the head of the host. Now, this is the 9th battle of the 12 Great Battles. Gilles and his companions then liberate Languille from the Chaos hosts of the Northmen in the 10th battle, before turning to Couronne, where they face a massive army of orcs and goblins at the river Sanez in the 11th battle. Now, it's said here that never before had such a great toll of greenskin lives been taken on a single day, nor ever since, and so much tainted blood soaked into the soil of that battlefield that if you were to visit there today, it remains as a marshland and swampy underfoot. Pretty grim stuff. Now, This takes us to Gilles and his companions' final battle to finally free the lands of the Bretonny tribes. Castle Couronne was beset by a huge greenskin counterattack after their defeat at the River Sanez. But it wasn't just greenskins Gilles needed to contend with here. Disaster struck right before the battle, as Skaven rose up in the city streets, slaughtering defenders and peasants aplenty, and making the static defences of the city almost worthless. But now Gilles was joined by the full complement of his 13 Grail companions, and they were said to be so effused with the power of the lady that they could not be stopped. Nobody's really sure how long this battle lasted, but it's suggested that they fought for a number of weeks to defend Couronne. The piles of dead were said to have been stacked like mountains, and funeral pyres burned slain enemies for so long that night became day for literal months after the battle ended. Alderond of Couronne was there, and he summed up this final battle well when he said, quote, "Mighty indeed was the last and most epic battle, and each companion performed such deeds as to fill the sagas of wordsmiths and scribes until the end of time. The moons raced across the darkened sky, replaced by the burning orb of the sun, but to no respite. Only the lady knows the number of weeks that saw battle, but against all odds the companions emerged victorious. The piles of dead were stacked like unto mountains, and searing pyres burnt the slain enemy, such that night was turned to day for a season and more. Thus was the 12th and final great battle won." End quote. And so the lands of the Bretonny tribes were finally secured in 979 IC. Gilles and his companions came together once again for a great meeting. Here they created the formal Bretonnian dukedoms, with each companion becoming a duke, and they named the collective lands Bretonia. Gilles was crowned king, known as the leader of battles. The lands of Bretonia finally knew peace, and Gilles passed from warrior and saviour into king and ruler. The sources suggest here that Gilles never quite adjusted to this new way of life. He didn't feel like he really had a place in this world anymore, and he would often travel around the kingdom, actively seeking out battle wherever it could be found, searching for the glory of days past. It must have been a huge culture shock, to be fair to him, to go from 4 years of seemingly endless battle, where every day could have been his last, fighting against seemingly insurmountable odds, all the way now to sitting around in castles, administering the construction of a kingdom. Gilles ruled relatively successfully for 17 years, until a dark day in 996 IC, where he was suddenly and mysteriously slain from afar by a fell weapon fired by an unknown hand. And interestingly, actually, this is apparently the reason why modern Bretonnian knights refuse to use any ranged weapons themselves, despite not minding their peasants using them, of course. The dishonour of their genuine god of war being slain in such a cowardly and underhand way has enmeshed itself into Bretonnian noble culture ever since. It's said that as he passed from the world, Gilles had a final vision from the lady. He instructed his companions to carry him to a nearby lake, where he was placed onto a boat that floated off and disappeared into the mists. Here it was hoped that Gilles would stand by the lady's side for all eternity. Now, before we go, it's supposed that this was not the last the old world would see of Gilles. The power of the lady was known to be such that future generations of knights would continue to seek her out to have an opportunity to drink from the same grail and become Grail Knights reborn. It is said that these questing knights must face a final test before being granted access to the lady. A green knight materialises before them atop an enormous steed, brandishing a glowing blade that is suffused with fey power. These questing knights must duel the Green Knight and test their faith before being allowed to pass to the lady. This, however, is a story for another time. So I'm going to leave you now with the last words of Gilles Le Breton to ring in your ears. Quote, "In the time of Bretonia's greatest need, when it seems that all hope is gone, I shall return to aid you." End quote. Thank you, everyone, so much for listening to the first episode of the Old World Chronicles. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with your friends. We really appreciate your support. If you have any suggestions for topics you'd like to see covered in a future show, please comment below and I'll take these on board.